My dad single-handedly broke up a fight where 5 people were smashing another guy's face in. What is something you have seen a parent do that made you think they were totally badass? My family was on vacation when I was about 12 and we went to the beach. The water was pretty rough that day and there was one area full of all these jagged rocks. Well, my dad was teaching me how to surf that day and he'd already warned me not to go near the rocks because a rip was forming over there. So there we are, out in the middle of the ocean, amidst all the other tourists when my dad goes stay on the board and stay here and swims away. I hadn't been paying attention but apparently my dad had noticed these teenagers swimming near the rocks and one of them got caught in the rip. He had managed to grab onto a rock so he wasn't being pulled any deeper but the waves were crashing over him and it was clear he wasn't going to be able to hold on much longer. As I watched my dad swam over and managed to pull the kid to safety, avoiding the rocks and waves and fighting back against the rip. He then proceeded to lecture the kid about ocean safety because, you know, he is a dad. Dad pulled 2 unconscious women off the bottom of a hotel pool, alternated CPR on both and revived them. If saving lives is not enough, watched him punch a shark while scuba diving to drive it away from the dive party. You know that game at the fair where you try and run against the bungee cord for a prize? When I was a kid we went to a fair and a big firefighter tried that game and didn't win it. Then a marine home on leave tried it and didn't get it. Then my 42-year-old dad gave it a go and won. The carnies were super confused because they only had the one prize and they didn't have a backup in case someone won, but they had to give it to us. It was awesome. Also he burst all the blood vessels in his face and looked like a monster for a week, but still, awesome. This was in Sweden during the 90s. My mom was waiting in line at the bus stop when she noticed a couple of skinheads harassing a couple of immigrant kids, so she screams at them, "You dickheads, cuckhaven, are supposed to love everything Swedish." A real Swede waits in line and shuts the frick up, which they did immediately. The European Q Olympics must be a very tight race. My dad was fetching my sister at her primary school when some thieves on motorbikes snatched a lady's purse off. He dropped my sister down, asked her to wait, chased after the thieves on his motorbike, kicked the thieves down and then proceeded to beat the crap out of both of them and handed them to the police. Some days later the police called him up to the station to get some kind of awards, but he refused because he didn't want any publications. In his words, "I didn't want the thieves to remember my face. It might endanger your sister since the thievery occurred near her school." The fact that he refused any recognition for that makes this so much cooler. My dad went from aging alcoholic after my brother died to sober overnight. Going from 36 cans of beer a day to nothing the next morning is still one of the strongest things I've ever seen. From someone whose family is full of raging alcoholics, and me being one of them at a point in my life, respect. Liquor is much easier to get than drugs. You don't drive by your local H shop every day. You don't sit around with friends and family while you all do H. You don't go out to dinner and everyone else is ordering a side of H. I'm glad he's sober now. It seems like a small thing overall in light of these stories, but it still seems badass to me. My 70-year-old grandfather, World War II veteran, while dying of lung cancer and on an unsuccessful round of chemotherapy, rebuilt an external staircase on the side of his house. Everything was level, straight, and perfect. When we cleaned out their house 5 years later, I had to take a rail off that stair to get something out. By I mean it took 3 of us. My dad has always been a big, physically impressive guy, 6 feet 3 inches, about 220 pounds, getting portlier in his old age, but used to be pretty fit too, so he's always been a towering figure to me, seemingly physically unstoppable. But what really set him apart for me was his charisma, so he took me, my brother, and our 2 best friends to Cedar Point. For those unfamiliar, Cedar Point is probably one of America's most famous amusement parks, known for being home to a number of record-setting roller coasters. For a weekend trip, when we arrived, it turns out that the hotel The Breakers had erroneously overbooked. We were told that our rooms had been given to other guests, and after a lengthy discussion with management, that with apologies, were basically sold. Now my mom has always been a very uptight, by the book, what you see is what you get kind of person, and I kinda took after her in that regard. I was ready to admit defeat. My dad, however, Told us kids to wait in a nearby, and he'd fix this. I idolized him, but I wasn't sure how he planned to get us into a full hotel. He popped into a nearby gift shop, walked up to reception with a flower in hand, and after a wave of smiles and giggling on the part of the clerk up front, 20 minutes later we were escorted to the hotel's premium suites. For free, no less. We were given vouchers for another stay, and then were allowed to pay the rate for the suites for which we'd originally booked, and my jaw dropped. Now that I'm an adult, I've had more experience, and the idea that sus being kind and talking to someone rarely if ever hurts your chances, so I can understand better that it wasn't magic, just being nice. But to 10-year-old me, it was like wizardry. It was just so effortless. Everyone liked my dad. He could talk his way out of anything. To a kid that still stammered nervously when forced to order his own food in public because I was so afraid of strangers. It really made him larger than life. Sounds like my dad. My dad got involved in a strange love triangle when I was about 12. He dated this girl for a while, but she was crazy. Broke up, got nasty, and she eventually told her new boyfriend a few weeks later that my dad had been trying to come over to lay the smack down on her vagine. Well, the guy didn't like that so much, so he knocked on my father's door for an hour or so. My dad didn't want to talk to him. My dad walked outside and the guy pulled a gun on him. It was absolutely horrifying to see my father about to be shot by some nutcase. I was looking on through the window. I was so scared, and only 12. I ran to call the police. Halfway through the police phone call I hear my dad yell, "That's right, B, pull a gun on a mother like me again." Apparently my dad had disarmed him and pistol whipped his skull so hard the guy couldn't stand. I should also mention my dad served 3 years in prison before I was born for a felony. On another note, he is the most wonderful father a person could ever ask for. This week on When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong, a jealous lover should have realized his skanky girlfriend was leading him into trouble when she told him another man was trying to lay the pipe on her while she was home alone. He should have let it slide, but he chose to keep it real. Sleeping at my cabin once with my family, immediate family and parents. Wake up to my grandma screaming at my grandpa in the middle of the night. Look out the window and see my grandpa butt naked holding a 9mm staring down a black bear. Apparently he got up to go to the bathroom and saw a black bear trying to climb in his bedroom window. Still not sure how he got a gun out so fast. Parents. For some reason I imagined two middle-aged parents in gangsta clothing and talking like G's. My uncle was a cameraman for Fox during the Dallas Cowboys Super Bowl riots in '93. He noticed a group of men beating the heck out somebody across the street. Nobody was doing anything about it, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He was wielding one of those giant news cameras since he was supposed to be filming the parade. He ran across the street and started swinging the behemoth of a camera at the group of people. They all scrambled out of the way but didn't leave. My uncle stood over the beating man while swinging his camera at anyone that came near. The police showed up and took over from there. There is a video of this somewhere. They interviewed my uncle and showed some clips of him standing over the man. I wish I could find it. I'm surprised it's not on YouTube. I would really like to see this video. I hope you find it. I'm at work or I'd help in the search myself. When I was a kid, I watched my dad lasso a rattlesnake with a shoestring. He was a park ranger, and he's always been very into wildlife. He was getting ready for a yearly presentation that his organization would take around to the area elementary schools about local wildlife and ecology. So of course, he needed a rattlesnake. We went out driving one afternoon and happened to see one across the road, so he stopped to catch it. He had a glass box for it in the back of his truck. Who doesn't drive around with a snake box? But he didn't have the stick he'd usually use to capture it. So he pulls off his sneaker and takes the shoelace out, and after a couple of tries proceeds to lasso the freaking thing, put it in the box, and take it home. My dad is freaking awesome. I read this as, when I was a kid, I watched my dad make a lasso with a rattlesnake and a shoestring. I need to get more sleep, and I should probably be paying attention in class right now, but read it. Basically, I didn't know my dad was a jiu-jitsu black belt. One day, my dad, his friend from university, and I went somewhere. I'm not sure where anymore. I was dozing in the back of the car because it was quite late, when all of a sudden my dad stops the car, puts it in reverse, drives backwards for 15 meters or so and say, "Let's go Raj." Raj, unlike my dad, was a very tall and buff Indian that could not be brought down easily. My dad on the other hand is about 1.83 meters tall, which is quite average. Anyway, they take off their seat belts and get out, walking down an alley. I get out and see that there is a commotion at the end of the alley. I hear my dad say something and repeating the same thing over and over. After about 1 minute, he stops talking and Raj and him disappear into the kerfuffle. 30 seconds later, everyone is on the floor, except for my dad and Raj, and 3 women. They walk back to the car, and my dad said, "Get in the boot on bag. We have some ladies that we need to escort to their homes." TLDR. Black belt dad and angry Indian save the day, and return with 3 women. OP turns into animal to be sat in the boot of car. I thought it was awesome that your dad called you a neon bag, until I realized it's your username. My dad fought off a bunch of guys that jumped him in the middle of the street by blocking off his car. They wanted to steal the car. He threw the keys onto the sidewalk and proceeded to kicking their asses. They had some sort of makeshift weapons. Don't remember now, but it was sticks or batons, and they fricked his back up with them pretty bad. Basically, they were a bunch of pussies who were used to scaring people into submission, and they ran the frick away as soon as he put up a fight and knocked some teeth out. He came back home a bit bruised up, but nowhere near as bad as you'd imagine, except for his knuckles. Goddamn it, his knuckles were fricking raw. I did think he was fricking badass after that, but mostly I was really pissed off about what happened and that I wasn't there. Similarly, my dad and I were riding bikes when a guy threw a moldy peach at my dad. Without any hesitation, Pops ripped off his bike pump and threw it through their side window. They screeched to a stop. My dad rode up to the car and reached in to get his pump. They did nothing. My dad ended the Cold War. He was studying over in Russia during the late 80s, right around the end of the war. One day him and some of his friends from the States went on a huge party boat with some Russians. A local news crew was there and they interviewed him. Russian women in either arm, of course. He said something along the lines of, "Us Americans don't want to keep this feud going. We love the Russians. We want to be allies and partners." Apparently Gorbachev was watching this live feed and later wrote in him memoirs, "I saw American and Russian students getting along, having a good time and being friends. I then decided to call Reagan and begin talks of peace." So now my dad likes to tell people he ended the Cold War. I like to be about my dad because, let's be honest, he's kind of a dong, but he does have his awesome moments. When I was 10, we had an old bull named Bruce we used for breeding. He kinda reminds me of the guys on Jersey Shore, all pumped up on testosterone, completely retarded, and wanting to beat everything the frick up. One day, I'm minding my own business, doing my farm chores, when I hear a loud bang. Turn around, there's a crumpled up gate and Bruce is out of his pen, staring me down. He's moving his head back and forth, sizing me up, deciding whether or not I'm a threat. There's a soft clinking noise as the chain attached to his nose ring drags across the concrete. Then he stops, lifts his head, stares behind me, and my father, driving the skid loader, charges in from seemingly nowhere, placing himself between me and the bull. I flee to the safety of the barn. As I turn around to shut the door, I see my father ram the skid loader into Bruce, shouting his redneck war cry, "Ew up in there." Bruce, startled, jumps back into his pen. Dad parks the skid loader in the gap, climbs out, and walks away, like a boss. My granda also raises cattle. He is a tough son of a bee. I have seen him corner bulls, and run them around. One time his breeder, bull, cornered him behind a tree. His war cry is yo, yo, yo bull, yo as he is running around this tree. Eventually the bull got tired of the game and walked away. Funny as crap, and it's no unaffectionate way for our family to yell at each other. Yo, yo. My grandpa came upon a waking black bear and punched him in the nose, so the black bear ran away. Imagined your grandpa punching Winnie the Pooh in the face for some reason. While on a humanitarian trip to Africa with my mother and a few others, a few guys started yelling at us at around 6 in the morning while we waited for our bus and started getting closer and closer. She basically let off a pterodactyl scream and told them to frick off. They did indeed. Frick off. I was very proud. I am not familiar with this tactic. I'm 25 and my dad is 45. I was playing around with my 3-year brother on the trampoline this summer. My dad walked up to us and asked if I still knew how to do a backflip. Sure, I said, and proceeded to do a shabby backflip, barely landing on my feet. The old man laughed mockingly, adding that was the worst backflip I've ever seen. He then stepped onto the trampoline and proceeded to perform a perfect double backflip, then walked back to the house and popped a beer. I did flips a lot in high school, sometimes on trampolines but mostly on the ground or off of something. I graduated about 6 years ago, and about 1 year, so 5 years after not having done that sort of thing, I attempted a backflip and nearly broke my neck. Couldn't imagine surviving one in another 20 years. My dad's a Vietnam vet. When my sister and I were little, he took us into Chicago on Chinese New Year to watch the parade in Chinatown. The day was wonderful, everything was magical, so on and so forth. And while we were walking to the nearest subway station, some homeless guy who was obviously tweaking out on something got in my dad's face. He started screaming that my dad was a liar and a fraud, he'd never been a soldier, he'd never seen war etc. My father always used to wear his army jacket, and my dad just ignored him and moved us to his side away from the crazy dude. The hobo didn't approve and got in my older sister's face. She was 8 or 9, I think, and started to scream at her, "Your dad is a fraud" and that sort of thing. Really scary and threatening. We both started to cry, and my dad just kinda shoved us back and then roundhouse kicked that mother right in the face. He went down like a sack of potatoes and my dad picked me up, grabbed my sister's hand and we pretty much ran down the street. I remember watching the hobo over my dad's shoulder just laying on the ground, holding his head and wailing at the top of his lungs. I had no idea that my dad knew any sort of martial arts. I was in little kid karate, so I kinda had an understanding of what he did, even though I wouldn't know the name for it until I was a lot older, and I've never to this day seen him do anything remotely close to that. I'm from Chicago. Upvotes for helping us contain the aggressive hobo population with awesome roundhouse kicks. My father works on offshore oil rigs and was stationed off the coast of Nigeria. He was in an airport waiting for his next flight out when the flight was suddenly cancelled. The country they were going to fly over had just started a civil war. I'm not sure, but I believe he was in Togo, with no way of getting in touch with the office and little money on him. He bribed his way off the airport and tried to make his way to the embassy. He never made it. A few hours before he was supposed to arrive to the site, the office received a call asking for a ransom for my father. My father is insured for this through my company. It happens more times than you would think. So they brought in someone to handle the issue. They spoke with the kidnapper and they came to an agreement. The kidnapper said he would call the next day to say when and where to perform the trade. The next day, the kidnapper never called. He never called the next day either. The man got in contact with the proper authorities to file a report and see what needed to be done. Early in the morning of the 4th day since the kidnapping, a beat-up Jeep, with my father at the wheel, showed up. They said he was covered in blood and dirt, and sunburned all to heck. He was escorted by guards into the embassy where he told them who he was. They were briefed on what happened, but no one had completed any kind of transfer, so they asked what happened. He said, "I killed them." It then became apparent the blood on him wasn't his. The embassy called the company called me, and I flipped my crap. My father went to the hospital to get checked and then headed home immediately. He went to the office and told his boss he's never going there again. He said okay. His boss is now scared of him. When my dad came home, I asked him if he was alright. He said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I really want to get a Jeep, though. They handle real well." This is my now deceased uncle. He was going to see his girlfriend in a real rough part of Philly back in the 70s, I guess it was. These 3 guys come up to him in his car when he is stopped at a light and try to carjack him. They pull him out of the car, and after he managed to get to his feet, he tears into these guys with pure violence. The 3 guys get pretty banged up, and the cops arrive and take everyone in. A few weeks later there is a trial. The 3 men, not wanting to go to jail for carjacking, say that my uncle started it all and they were the victims. So in this courtroom, my uncle and his 2 brothers, one of which being my dad, all over 6 foot, all big and broad shoulders. We're watching this trial unfold when my uncle gets called to the stand, and this is what the carjacker's lawyer says. "Now, mister, how tall are you?" 6 feet 2. "And how much do you weigh?" "About 210 pounds. "And you mean to tell me that my clients, not one over 5 feet 8 and barely 180 pounds, would try to attack you?" To which my uncle replies, "Well, I look a lot smaller when I am sitting in my car." Courtroom erupts in laughter as this ridiculous attempt at a defense falls apart. As a shorter guy, this is true. When sitting down, torso length is pretty similar. The height comes from the legs. I saw my 40-year-old mother floor 2 20-something men trying to steal her friend's car. More details please. On my mom's side, there was some pretty hideous generational dysfunction that nobody seemed to be able to beat. Like 3+ generations running of alcoholism, father figure issues, etc. Mom helped stop a ton of that crap from ever getting passed down to my brother and I. Dad's family grew up extremely poor, lower class Mexican in South Texas. He resolved to never be poor, so he took out loans and worked his butt off to become a petroleum engineer, and now he's rich. I consider them to be equally badass. This is my favorite one. Not some superhuman feat, but just doing what was best for their kids, and coming from nothing and making a name for himself. Tell your parents I said they are awesome. A pickup, small Toyota pickup, fell on his friend while said friend was working underneath it on the transmission. My dad picked up the back end of the truck, pivoted it around in a circle until it was off him, and set it back down. The front tires never left the ground, but still a pretty impressive featuring. If the front tires left the ground as well, we finally found Superman. My mom was the assistant manager at a small record store concert venue restaurant years and years ago. She's 5 feet 3 inches, moderately thin, and covered in tattoos and piercings. On multiple occasions, I had seen her break up fights and throw big guys out of the place on her own. Your mum was as a fricking MILF. At a local green space, some kids were doing jumps with their BMX bikes, biking up little hills to get air, or whatever you call it. My parents and I were out walking our dog when we heard screaming start, ran over, and this boy had come down in such a way that the handlebar of his bike was in his thigh. My mom was so calm. She told my stepdad to take the dog and go get the truck. This is pre-cell phone, and started tending to the kid's leg, using an extra shirt to stop the bleeding. She talked to the kid to keep him calm, and never batted an eyelash. Definitely thought she was a badass. I, 19 back then and I'm a girl, was on a holiday with my parents and sister when it was getting dark on the streets of Jerusalem as we were wandering about. I walked next to my dad when a guy tried to pass me in a, as I thought, clumsy way, which made him walk up against my side. His hand landed on my upper leg. I looked back at him passing only to see my mother, a calm, friendly, intellectual woman, slap the guy in the face hard. It must have been my imagination that made her grow bigger and the poor guy smaller. She stood closer, she pointed her finger at his face and calmly but very loudly said, "Don't touch my daughter." By that time, she was about 2.5 meters tall and the guy almost disappeared in the ground. The guy mumbled no 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 and ran off. Apparently he tried to grab me. Thanks mom. One grabber down. Moms like that are the best. I wasn't there and we had to drag the story out of him, but my father was held up by 2 unarmed guys after he went to an ATM. His response was to punch one of the guys so hard in the face that he got knocked out and the other guy ran the frick away. I was sitting in the passenger seat when I was like 12 years old when my dad got pulled over by a cop. After the cop asked, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he responded with, "Do you?" I let out a loud "Oh damn," and my father proceeded to get a large fine. Sorry if I had anything to do with that, Dad. Go to your room. Was traveling with my dad when I was a kid, about 100 miles from our hometown. We'll call it Derpville. Stopped at a grocery store for something and this kinda sketchy dude in the parking lot stops us on the way out of the store and starts telling some story about how he is from Derpville and needs money to get home to his baby or something. My dad keeps walking back to the truck and gets in. Little kid me says, "Why didn't you want to help that guy?" Dad says, "Because he's lying." "How do you know?" "Because I can tell." And his story is bulls. You don't know that. And he is from Derpville. We could at least give him a ride. He's not from Derpville. He just looked at our plates when we got here. And he doesn't want a ride. He just wants money. Probably for drugs. That's not fair. You don't even know that for sure. You say to always help people when you can. Dad looks at me and says okay. Lesson time. Come on. He gets out of the truck. Takes a pistol out from under the seat. And tucks it into the front of his waistband. My dad never did crap like this. Ever. I didn't even know he had a gun. So I was just staring. Wide-eyed. Stay behind me and don't say anything. He walks up to the guy and says, so why do you need money again? Guy says, man, my baby. She at home with my little girl and I need to get home to Derpville. She ain't got no formula, she hungry. Dad says, okay, I can give you a lift back to Derpville. Guy says, no man, I gotta wait on my girlfriend. But we still needs money to buy formula. My check ain't come this week yet from work. Dad says, where do you work? Guy says, the Red Lobster in Derpville. Dad asks Guy his name. Then pulls out cell and calls Red Lobster in Derpville. They never heard of the guy. Guy gets pissy. Pushes my dad and starts cursing at him. Dad lifts up shirt to reveal that he's strapped. Guy's eyes get big and he runs away. Thought my dad was like Steven Seagal. Then later that day I had to go wake him up after he fell asleep on the toilet. TL. DR. Corrected. Poser not from Derpville. Dad scares him off. Falls asleep on toilet. On a sailing trip last week, my dad popped his shoulder out of its socket during a storm. He took 2 seconds, had me tie a rope around his wrist, stepped on the rope and popped it back in like it was no big deal. The fact that he's got a PhD in physics somehow makes it that much cooler. Once a burglar entered our hallway without us knowing it. Obviously, I was getting ready for school. My dad was going to ride the bike with me like usual. Yada, yada. So I opened the door to the hallway and there's this guy, holding up my bike. I'm just looking at him looking at me with a "Osh T. This wasn't supposed to happen" face. Dad comes in, manly yells at aforementioned burglar and kicks him out of the hallway, and proceeds to cycle to school with me. I've never felt threatened in my home. I must have been about 9. Also, once a rat crawled up his pant leg in the middle of the street in Paris during rush hour. He just took his pants off and stood there shaking a rat out of his pants. In the middle of the street in his underpants. My dad's pretty normal. My dad was the type that hated doctors and dentists. He grew up poor, so his family never could afford to visit them before the days of Medicaid. At one time while securing a load on his trailer, he was a truck driver. He had the come-along brake and the chain snapped back and hit him in the face, causing a big gash in his forehead. He came into the house and washed it off, then grabbed some needle and thread and Rambo style, sewed up his cut. He also pulled his own tooth once with a pair of needle nose pliers. Next story. Being a truck driver during the big Teamsters strike back in the 70s, he was often shot at and had attempted hijackings. During one of the attempted hijackings, he had 2 guys jump on his truck. He grabbed a tire iron and smashed the hands of the guy on the driver's side and then drove close to the edge of the road to try and knock the guy on the passenger side off against a street sign. My mum stopped a car from rolling down a hill after an old guy forgot to put his handbrake on. It was the weirdest thing in the world to see my mum just holding onto this car whilst waiting for the guy to come out of the shop. This happened to me once on a really busy street. I felt like freaking Superman. Stopping a car from rolling. My feet were gradually being pushed down the hill, but then I managed to bring it to a complete stop and began pushing it back up the hill. People were stunned, until some random guys helped me and stole my glory. Both my dad and my uncle were in the military for a long time. My uncle was for sure a commando and my dad did some crazy crap too. They won't really talk about it and they're both older now and aren't very active, so you can't really tell that they had this history or any type of physical abilities. A few years back, we were at a cabin in the mountains with my whole family. It's nighttime and the whole cabin is lit up while it's pitch dark outside. Some family member made the mistake of opening the door briefly. As I'm sure you can imagine, a bunch of bugs came in. One of these bugs was unfortunately a hornet the size of a grown man's fist. This was like a 50s horror movie hornet. This thing flies up all the way to the corner of the ceiling on the second floor, which was a lofty high ceiling situation. We're all terrified. My dad, in a moment of badassery, takes the hornet spray can and stands up on the pool table underneath the ceiling where the bug was. He's gingerly approaching the bug with the can when all of a sudden the hornet realizes what's going on and bum rushes my dad. My dad, in a truly Neo-inspired moment, side flips off the pool table while simultaneously wrecking this hornet's crap with the spray. He is dead on accurate while flying through the air and lands on his feet and tucks into a roll. The hornet, not knowing how his day could be ruined so thoroughly and awesomely, flies into a few walls and collapses to his death. The family is literally cheering after finally managing to pick our chins up off the ground. He never did anything like that before or since, but to this day I will never forget him and his Matrixy night. My dad got pulled over for running a stop sign when I was 8. Cop walked up and said, "Did you see that stop sign back there?" My dad said, "Yep, but I didn't see you." He laughed his butt off and let us off with a warning. "I'm guessing you aren't black." I saw a dad wave his hand at an automatic door and then turn to his son and say, "One day you'll learn, young Padawan." I do this whenever I notice a little kid by nearby and give them a look like, "Yup, that just happened." I just walk as fast as I can normally and see if I can't hit the door. Hasn't worked yet. One time my dad was parallel parking at night in a city near us, on a one-way street. He did so politely, slowed down, used his blinker, etc. This piece of crap racer was coming up behind us, blaring subs and honking at us, with the driver yelling and cursing at us. "Get the frick out of the way." My father calmly honked back a couple times, until the guy pulled up closer, got out of his car and ran up to ours. My dad looked at me and said in a calm, firm voice, "Stay in the car." My father proceeded to get out of the car, cracked his knuckles and yelled, "I've had about enough of you freaking punks." My dad is a big guy, about 6'2" and built like a truck, yet he is a very calm, professional, nice guy. When the driver of the racer saw my dad, jumped back in his car, threw it in reverse, and backed down the entire street. My dad got back in the car, completely straight-faced, and finished his parking job like nothing even happened. I was so proud, and legitimately thought I was about to see my father destroy some little punk. Man, I can't wait for dad's strength. It's going to be glorious. I was attacked by a Rottweiler when I was 7 and my dad broke the jaw of the dog from opening his mouth. While having dinner with my family a few years ago, my dad goes in his room and brings out a lockbox. He proceeds to pull out all of these patents from various countries for various adhesives and plastics he invented. I always thought my dad was super smart, but now I just think he's an international badass. We were going crabbing and there was an alligator that had gotten itself wrapped up in hooks. My dad calmly pulls the sucker out of the water by its legs and carefully undoes all of the hooks and lets him go. That alligator needs to get his crap together. My dad survived quadruple bypass open heart surgery in 1986, then brain surgery 3 months later. Not once did I ever hear him complain. Your dad is badass. My mom's facing terminal esophagus cancer. She's now doing 3 weeks on, 1 week off in chemo so she can be eligible for a trial drug. She says she's not doing it for her but to help the research, thus hopefully helping others in her situation. When I was about 14 I was jumped by about 5 guys, and along with beating me up they destroyed my bike. My father picked me up from a friend's house, and saw my bike and asked what happened. My friend told my dad and we drove over to the house of the kid where all of these kids hung out. There was a large group there sitting on the yard from about age 17 and up. My dad hangs out the door of his van and asks who broke my kid's bike. They all get up and start walking towards the van, and he got back in spraying them all with rocks. We drove home and they followed shortly after in a pickup with about 10 guys. They pull into our driveway and my dad, knowing it would be 10 on 1, pulls out a large bumper jack bar that was about 5 feet long and made of steel. He just simply said, "Alright, let's go," and all of them jumped back in the truck and took off up the road and turned around. As they were driving back towards our house my dad stood at the edge of the driveway, and they swerved in at him. He swung the jack bar and took out the passenger side of the windshield and mirror. About 20 minutes later the police showed up with THR driver and passenger cuffed in the back, asked for what happened and arrested both of them for trespassing. I was about 12 and we had a bee infestation in the front yard of my parents' house. My dad is very allergic to bees but wanted to get rid of them for the sake of me and my younger brother. So with 2 cans of bee killer and an epinephrine shot between his teeth he went to battle. From the safety of the inside, my brother and I watched as my dad sprayed the beehive. Every couple of minutes he would back away, pump a stage of the shot into his arm and head back in. He came back inside after a bit, grabbed himself a beer and sat down to read the paper. Badass. I can't be the only person who thought of Left 4 Dead 2 while reading this. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.